So without further ado, it probably makes sense to go into really what is a training needs analysis. And to look at this in the most simple form, essentially this is in my mind, a structured way to implement training and development plans for whether it's an organization, a team within an organization, or a specific individual within that organization. And it really comes down to what the end goal of what the training is going to accomplish. And we always talk about start with the end in mind. And in this case, that's really important. When we identify maybe a challenge or a goal that the organization is looking for, we want to keep that in mind as we start to think about how are we going to then find out what is the root cause of that challenge, or what is going to be one very important aspect of that goal that the organization has that we can then assess if that is truly the challenge that we're seeing, or if there's maybe something else that we need to identify. And then how does training play a role in that? So why is a training needs analysis important? A couple of big things, obviously, defining and prioritizing those greatest areas of needs, really making sure that we're not what we in the industry call train and pray, right? We train them and hope that that's the solution to the problem. What we want to do is really assess, do we have the right problem identified? And then is training the right solution? That in some cases, we do a training needs analysis and we find that training is not the challenge, it's the people or the process or a number of other things. Identifying a performance and skill gap. In many cases, you don't even know that there's a skill gap until you really assess. You made some assumptions about the personnel, about the process, and you assume that they're being used correctly. And you might find that there's a skill gap that you just didn't know about. Developing data for evaluation. This is a big thing when we talk about the beginning with the end in mind. If the goal is a return on investment, if the goal is to grow sales, we want to develop metrics while we're planning for training so that at the end of it, we can measure the effectiveness. And a part of that effectiveness is the cost to benefits ratio, the return on investment. If you are going to be investing time, money, resources into training and developing staff, you want to obviously see some measurable outcomes. And if we don't define what we're going to be measuring early on in the process, we may be flying by the seat of our pants as we go along. Another key benefit here, and I hear this a ton as I work with organizations, obtaining management support. When you get management feedback and you get directly from the horse's mouth the reason why training would be useful or valuable, managers are now more inclined to want to put their staff in, to want to have the time and energy and those resources and the people being out of pocket. They'll be more inclined to support that initiative and be on board. Chances of reaching learning goals. So if you don't define the goals, it's very hard to actually reach the goals, and certainly hard to measure them. And then just overall improving employee morale. When you get them engaged and you show that the company is thinking about training, thinking about investing, thinking about the future of their employees, people will tend to see a future for themselves within the organization because they see the organization thinking about their future. So with that being said, I'll go into the 4-step process that I follow when I do a training needs analysis for an organization. The first is to identify those business goals. We talked about it again, the start with the end in mind. Step 2, we go through the data gathering process. Now we start to maybe we have a hypothesis about how or why training is needed, but we need to either confirm that or confirm that there's another challenge, other needs, other priorities that we should be focusing on. Then from there, we take the information that we've gathered and we assess what training options truly and effectively answer our needs. And then from there, now you get to the logistics, and this could be the fun part or the unfun part, depending on what part of this journey you really thrive with. But building the training plan, putting it into motion, actually effectively delivering the training and measuring how effective it is. And this is really a circular process. You do this over and over and over again. And this changes as you're getting feedback, as the years go by, as the months go by. You're really in a feedback loop. You are effectively identifying those needs and doing it all over again. So step one, we are identifying those business goals, starting with the end in mind. You'll start by taking a stock of the organizational goals or known deficiencies. And there's a certain limitation to those known deficiencies, right? We don't know what we don't know. So part of what we're trying to do is suss out what maybe is a challenge that we don't know about, or a root cause to a challenge that we think we know, but we may not know the actual cause behind it. Some things to start with that this always helps me frame this in my mind: organizational targets. What are the sales goals? What are the manufacturing goals? Each plant in a manufacturing supply chain may have certain percentages and goals and numbers of widgets that need to be created in a certain amount of time. These are really key to understand. Where are these key stakeholders looking at success and failure, right? Then to that point, the department specific goals. You have different managers that are thinking about the micro goals. You have these macro goals throughout the entire organization, but each department head is looking at something very specific. And then there's outside influences, hiring practices, turnover, what kind of political, economic factors may affect training right now. I think that's one that we've all seen come into place in 2020 and 2021. We know outside influences could greatly change the way that we conduct training, that we plan training, that we have to be nimble and flexible when it comes to delivery and making sure that we're teaching the right topics. An entire training plan can change on a dime if things do change. And then when we look at these and we really probe deeper, we ask ourselves, on the surface level, is there a challenge or is there an opportunity that training would solve? So in some cases, you're looking at some of these examples, and you might see a challenge that is a person issue, a personnel issue. We just don't have the right people in place. You might have a challenge where you need a drastic overhaul of the process. Maybe there's an 18-step process for something that should only take 2. And you don't want to train everybody in 18 steps if we're going to be changing the process to a better 2-step process down the line, or more importantly, we should be looking at changing that process now so that we can get started on new training that teaches them that 2-step process. And that becomes the main purpose of a training needs analysis. There's a model out there that I follow, the KSA model, if you will, knowledge, skills, or attitudes. When we ask ourselves, does training solve this issue? It comes down to these 3 main categories. Is it a knowledge issue? Is it a skills issue? Or is it an attitude issue? All of these can be changed. Knowledge being that institutionalized experience held by employees, more holistic view of the knowledge that they hold, whereas skills applies to the different tasks that they can complete. So more implementation of that knowledge. And then attitudes. This is that behavioral aspect. You need to coach somebody at customer service so you can improve customer service success tickets, so on and so forth. But if it's one of these 3 areas, if you can cleanly identify that it's a knowledge gap, it's a skills gap, or an attitudinal gap, you have a need for training. And now it becomes a matter of what's the analysis that I can do to effectively design a solution to that knowledge, skill, or attitude gap. This is a good way to look at how we are identifying some of those key gaps. With knowledge, skills, and attitude, they fall into different sides of the brain. Left brain, this is more that engineer, that technical side of your brain, the one that deals with mathematics and logistics and things like that. And then you have that right brain half, that creative side, that process and that people person side. And we all have 2 sides of our brains, right? So it's not a matter of one side fits each. It's a matter of identifying if there are left brain aspects, if there's more technology challenges or gaps in the use of the skills and the tool or use of the tools that they're using, or is it a challenge of them just using the tools the right way or in the right process? Just as a frame of reference, when we talk about New Horizons, it's helpful for me when I look at everything that we do and everything that I and my company offer when we are helping organizations. I've separated all of our different products and our offerings into these areas. When we look at security and coding, IT infrastructure, data and cloud, we know we're talking primarily in that left brain engineering side. In the right brain, we're talking about business productivity, the different processes that people are following in terms of project management, process improvement, IT service management, right? Even though it's an IT role, there is a right brain component to it. Leadership and management is a big key area when it comes to this too, because that manager buy-in, like we said at the beginning, is so important to things flowing smoothly and training plans being effective. There's a great statistic out there. I always come back to it, but the number one reason an employee leaves their company is not because of pay. It's not because they didn't receive a promotion. It's not because the grass was super green on the other side of the fence. The number one reason an employee leaves their employer is their boss, their direct boss, their direct supervisor. That's from every survey that's been sent out over the years. And that's really telling. So we always want to make sure that we're not just addressing one side of this. We ask ourselves, even if we've identified a tool or a technology skills gap, we ask ourselves, is there a right brain component to this? And on the flip side, if we're talking about a business skill offering, we're asking ourselves, is there a technical component to this? Is there a tools component to this? All right, so now we've gotten there. Now we're going into step 2. We're gathering data. We're confirming or disconfirming the information that we think is true. So how do we go about getting data in the most effective way possible? You've heard me say this over and over and again, and I'll probably say it a few more times before this is over. We begin with the end in mind. We always want to look at those goals, and we want to make sure that our questions are geared towards the organizational goals, the departmental goals, really making sure that we're not making too many assumptions and we're confirming this information by asking open-ended questions. Setting timelines is extremely important. If we're doing a training needs analysis, and we'll get to a couple of ways that we go about doing this, the effective manners in which to do and conduct the questionnaires. We will always want to make sure that we have a very clear deadline for either respondents to complete a survey, for interviewers to have interviews done, a very clear deadline for when the results will be compiled and shared with key stakeholders. And that keeps everybody on track, but there's also another component of this. If you leave this open-ended, or if you put something out extremely far in the future, people are more inclined to wait to the last minute if they have 3 months than if they have 3 weeks. It's just funny how that works. And diversifying data sets is extremely important from my perspective. In working with a lot of organizations doing training needs analyses, what I've found is that people often, they rely a lot on open-ended questions and qualitative questions. And by qualitative questions, I mean they're asking questions about the quality, about that have more soft data answers. And by that I mean how is training conducted, or how effective is training right now. Ones that don't have a numerical answer, where you're asking, hey, what kind of training would you like to see in 2021? Whereas if you can identify some data points where you can get some real numbers and you can have some close-ended questions, you can start to get quantifiable data along with that qualifiable data, so that you get quantities. You can get some numbers of how many people want Excel training, how many people want communication training, how many managers feel that their staff are challenged in email etiquette. If you can get some of these hard numbers and percentages and facts and figures, you can start to build a really compelling story with that data. Whereas if you have too many open-ended questions, you're going to be finding yourself making a lot of assumptions, and it doesn't have that same gravity when you're delivering it to key stakeholders. A few things to think about in addition to this is, what are the goals of the business, department, individuals? We talked about that. What kind of teaching style does the target audience best respond to? This has changed quite a bit in the last 12 months. In 2020 and 2021, we've seen a lot of individuals more receptive to Zoom classes. No surprise in this day and age. What kind of training resources do you already have for that target audience? Do you have e-learning? Do you have live training already taking places? Does your employee base know about these resources? Another question, how much time is appropriate for the target audience to spend on training? When and where and how do they prefer training? What are the current levels of skills, knowledge, attitudes of the audience? And how does the organizational chart affect these training plans? And one thing I want to reiterate as we look at this slide is, don't assume anything about the answers to this. If you think that absolutely you know exactly how your staff wants training to take place, that's great, and you are very likely correct, but don't remove that question. Don't not ask that question just because you think you know the answer. You might be surprised, and those surprises are some of the most effective pieces of data when you do a training needs analysis. Now, effective ways to do this. I have 2 slides for this area, and I do it that way on purpose. There are 3 key activities that I always recommend that an organization does, whether they're using me and New Horizons as a resource for training needs analyses, or if they're doing them in-house. But the first 3 are really the big 3. This is what, if you can afford the time and energy to do these 3 things, this is the best practice. You want to have a survey or a questionnaire. You can do this electronically or the old-fashioned way, but some level of data gathering that's more scalable. You can send it out to the entire organization. SurveyMonkey and tools like that are very effective and very cost-effective ways of getting this information. Build a survey, tailor the questions to that business goal that you're trying to achieve, or a larger scope. Build and send that out to the entire staff. And you can get, even if only a certain percentage of the staff fills that out, you're getting a baseline of information that will get you some data points. Secondarily, you look at leadership and management interviews. Doing one-on-one interviews depends on the intent of your goals and the training needs analyses, but these don't have to be extremely long. They could be a half-an-hour meeting. They could be a 2-hour meeting. They could be full day, although I wouldn't recommend that. But doing those one-on-one interviews to get management perspective on how they see the training needs of the organization. And this is great because you get those key stakeholders that are really looking at the business objectives. They're very concerned about goals and meeting those goals. So they're going to be looking at this information with the best interests of the organization at heart. But then you also want to double that up with the employee focus groups. Take 5 to 10 random employees, or at least maybe targeted, but you're targeting certain groups that may have a like-minded focus, but more of the end users, the knowledge workers of the staff that aren't in management, and get their perspective. And if you do that in a group setting, you'll be surprised at what kind of information comes up. And in those focus groups, those group interviews, you see a lot of dynamics appear. Somebody says an idea, and their colleague has a new idea that is built on that old one. And so it effectively becomes a really good piece of, it gets you some really good data in terms of what the organization, what the employees perceive as the challenges. And so if I look at all three of these and look at them in something of a triangle of information, with the questionnaires and surveys, you're getting data points, you're getting facts and figures. With the leadership and management, you're getting the interests of the organization. And then in the third, in the focus groups with employees, you're getting information from the bottom of the organization, from the front line of the organization about where the perceived values are. And so when we look at this from a holistic view, I'm hitting kind of all three areas that I really need to make sure that that I need to have so that I can make effective decisions about where I'm going to spend training. The manager's perspective will be very different from the employee's perspective. They may both be correct. They both may be valid. They both may be wrong, but that's part of the process of confirming and working with different individuals. Additional tools that I would recommend, document and process review. So if you have job descriptions, great way to go build some idea of what technologies, what tools, what competencies that individuals need. Observations, actually sitting down and watching how an employee works or how a team interacts. Extremely effective, actually watching it in real time. Performance appraisals. Most organizations at least have a monthly or quarterly review system. Maybe it's a biannual or an annual process, but what are employees and their teams being measured on? Tests and assessments. We'll talk about this really briefly near the end of this, but one key factor in return on investment and measuring return on investment is ensuring or qualifying if the training was effective. So doing pre-class assessments, pre-class assessments and post-class assessments as a way of measuring growth in skill set or acquisition of new skills. Great and effective way to put some results on paper when you are doing the doing it. It's also in a way when you're doing it before classes or as a part of a training needs analysis, you're able to effectively find those skill gaps that you won't find in just a survey, an interview, or a focus group where somebody is giving a perception of skills. This is where you actually qualify if that perception is reality. And then advisory committees, I always recommend, it's great to have in that same manner of a focus group, but an ongoing group of individuals that have the interest of training and development at heart, where they're from different departments, or they're not necessarily in training, but they are, they're passionate about this, and they are always thinking about different ways that they can communicate the message from the rest of the organization to training in an honest and productive way. So that's a great way to make sure that's an ongoing process. So now we've gathered data. We've done a questionnaire, we've done some interviews, we've done some focus group interviews, and now we want to assess what options truly and effectively answer the information that we found. It's time to look at how those knowledge, skills, or attitude gaps can be solved. So first, and this might be obvious, but compare the list of training options and needs to the goals and priorities. So when we go back to how we started, we looked at goals and we looked at priorities and we looked at challenges and deficiencies. What the list of training that was identified by the employees, which ones match? That's a very clear way to find some priorities and where there's a match between perception and reality. And one way to look at this is connecting the training initiatives, the goals, and the needs that you found, and connect them to certain hard costs or soft costs. And there's a lot of information here, but I think this is an effective cheat sheet, if you will, as you are looking at the challenges that managers have identified, that the organization has identified as goals. Maybe one of the goals is to increase job satisfaction. Maybe one of the goals is to reduce employee turnover. And maybe you find that in different ways, people are saying the same thing, and they can be categorized as one unit. Somebody says, I have a problem with employee retention. I have a problem with employees leaving the company. I have a problem because I keep having to fire employees. These are all employee turnover issues. And if I consolidate all of those, I can maybe find that if I resolve one of these, I'm resolving all of them. We talked about that manager challenge, right? I've talked to a lot of organizations, and we've had to have a difficult conversation when we do this, and we find that I have a problem with employee turnover. I have too many people that are quitting, and I say I after working with your managers, working with your teams, I have to ask the question: is it a employee turnover issue, or is it a management issue? Are your managers driving people away? There's some coaching that can be done. And so when we identify this, now we have a clear plan. We have a way forward. We need to, with the goal of decreasing employee turnover, I'm going to target the managers to effectively build out a training plan that makes them, say, perhaps more emotionally intelligent, that allows them to work more effectively with a diverse, modern workforce, right? So we might find that some of these challenges, again, all coming back to one hard and soft cost, that is in the same vein. And what that allows us to do, especially when we convert it to or categorize it in one of these areas, in employee turnover, in that soft cost, we can start looking at what is the benefit if I do this program correctly, if we do this training effectively, and it has noticeable results. There's a dollar amount that the organization will see as a result of our training efforts. And this is why it's incredibly useful. If we can increase turnover, or if we can decrease turnover, then we won't have to pay for recruiting costs. We won't have to pay for new hire training. We won't have to pay for sick time that they left with. There's various hard and soft costs that come along with employee turnover that we can avoid. And if I can increase employee turnover, again, pardon me, if I can decrease employee turnover, I'm going to see those costs go down, and I can show the organization that this training initiative that we did was incredibly important and useful to the organization. And here's a dollar amount of what we meant to the organization. And you can imagine when you are delivering this to a CEO, CFO, to the organization's decision makers, why that's going to be so valuable and get so much buy-in at the beginning of the process. And when you're showing that here's the training that we did and here's why it was useful, that you're going to see a lot more, pats on the back about what you accomplished because you can show it. Some questions to ask as we're getting to this phase here too, right, is what business outcomes will result from that training, right? With employee turnover, we look at a very distinct and concrete example of what results we could achieve by improving emotional intelligence and modern, managing in a modern workplace. What kind of results that would have to employee turnover? Really identifying what that problem being solved is. What training is already being offered? It shouldn't continue. Are we already doing something in this? Are we already doing emotional intelligence? And then we have to ask ourselves, are we doing it in the most effective way? Should it continue to be offered? We should ask ourselves, is the training going to be conducted by somebody that we have on staff? Or are we going to need to look at some external providers to offer this particular solution? Do we have the right person on staff that can deliver this? Do we need to train that person to the level that they could? Or is it more worth our time to let that individual continue being good at what they are good at and focus on somebody or some external resource that could come in and deliver that more effectively and without the man hours of getting somebody up to speed? There's no one size fits all answer to this question or these questions, but they're worth asking. What is the best teaching method for the participants? What are we going to be doing this in a self-paced environment? You've seen over the years, sexual harassment, workplace harassment training is almost exclusively taught in a self-paced module now, because it's a yearly requirement. It's a compliance need. You need to have everybody on staff trained in this. So the most cost-effective, the most scalable option is self-paced training. Whereas you might have a very distinct group of managers that need this emotional intelligence training. Hopefully in the near future, the question is this something that we need to fly everybody into the same office and have this training session in person? Or can we do this without having to worry about flight costs, about travel and expenses? Can we do this in an online classroom? Is this group going to be able to effectively learn in this manner, right? So now we're really looking at the how with these questions. And at the end of the day, what we asked ourselves at the beginning, before we even did any data gathering, we asked ourselves, is there a knowledge, a skills, or attitudinal gap? And if there is, at this point, if every question I've asked myself and every question I've asked the staff has been, yes, it's one of these challenges. It's not a personnel challenge. It's not a process challenge. It's a knowledge, it's a skills, or it's a attitude gap. I'm going to then make a recommendation. And that's where we start to build that plan. And at this stage, for most individuals that are charged with building a training needs analysis, this is where you're delivering a plan as a recommendation to key stakeholders. So with that being said, knowing that your goal here is to get buy-in to how training is going to have effective results and measurable results, a couple of things I want you to keep in mind. Show your work. You don't want to just give recommendations and trust that they trust that you got to the right answer. Show them the work, give them the proof, show them the data. Hey, this is what the team said. Here were some of their answers. Here's one skills gap that we found that we didn't know about before. Here's how we did it. We did a survey, we did some interviews, we did some focus groups, and here's the raw data. We had 500 employees that took this survey. We had interviews with 20 managers, and we met with 30 individuals over 3 focus groups. And this is what we found. If you can show your work, you're going to have a really compelling message, and your audience is going to buy into your expertise in this. Visualizing the information as much as possible. If you can make charts and graphs, pretty simple idea here, but show it to them, make it, if you have a 20-page document and it's all long paragraphs, it's going to be a really hard sell. Whereas if you're looking at doing, various charts, numbers, again, going back to getting quantifiable data, if you have numbers and you have recommendations based off numbers and percentages, it's just much more compelling. And then connect that training to return on investment. Going back to that employee turnover example, doing this training will effectively increase or decrease employee turnover by 5%. What monetary value does that 5% have? So now we turn that into action. We're looking at key areas where we want to make sure that we have answers. We need to know what training delivery methods we are going to be using, and it might be a hybrid of a couple of approaches. We want to identify the personnel or the partner that is going to be delivering, right? We want to know if it's going to be Beth in L&D who's going to be delivering this class, or we're going to use an outside provider. New industry or technology trends, we want to identify those and how they play into this. One key area we hear all the time is we're upgrading to a new technology and we need to train the staff because they're going to see a different product tomorrow than the one they see today. Learning gaps and deficiencies, identifying where those are being answered, and goals around those. Regulatory requirements, again, that workplace harassment. We're seeing a lot more in terms of unconscious bias, and that very well could become something that needs to be, is going to be a compliance requirement in the future. Doing unconscious bias training, things like that. And changes to improve employee engagement, making sure your plan touches on how this is going to increase that. And then really key, and this probably should be higher up, but plans for tracking and assessing results. How are you going about measuring if the class was effective? And this is really a small snapshot of this concept, but what I would recommend, and I put the name of the book here, Return on Investment in Training and Performance Programs, a book by Jack Phillips. I highly recommend this for somebody who is getting into building out a training needs analysis or building out a training plan. It's a really great book on how to measure that return on investment. And one of the key things is, as you're doing training, you're collecting data in real time. And one key point that I took away when I first read this book on my first read, most organizations, probably about 80 to 90% of organizations, will ask the participants in training, how was training? Was it effective? How was the classroom? How was the instructor? And they'll do maybe a 10-point scale. Hey, so this class got a 9 out of 10. It was very effective. This class got a 6 out of 10. It wasn't very effective. Let's address how we can make that a better class. Okay, we've improved it. Let's test it again and see. Where most organizations don't go is any further than that, right? Building out assessments to measure if the training was effective. measuring if they, and that could be a quick quiz at the end of a class, or a quiz a week after the class. Hey, let's see if you remember this. Send them out an electronic quiz, build out some questions they can fill out at the end of class and get a grade, get a score, measure the actual what that means. And then you can go even further. So when we look at this on this chart in the data collection, there's a level 3. And that means looking at the application of the training, application of the skills that they learned in the training. And for many organizations, what that means is coming back to those individuals that took training 3 to 6 months after the class and seeing where they are now. Are they more productive? Are they making more sales? Is the factory that took this training producing more than they were before the training took place? And we look at that business impact, and that's level 4. What is that impact on the organization? And then with that impact, decreased employee turnover, increased productivity from that factory, increased sales. We can put a dollar amount on what that means, and now we have return on investment. We sold 20% more because we did that sales training with that team. They now sell $1.2 million instead of $1 million every year. And now I can look at that and say, we had a noticeable impact of $200,000, right? That's that business impact. That's the end all be all. One thing I will leave you with, if you do have questions, concerns, or you would like to speak to myself or anybody here at New Horizons, this is what we do. I'm more than happy to share insights and tips and tricks in one-on-one meetings, and I'd be happy to be a resource.